Good evening. Good evening. It's so nice to see so many here. I want to welcome alumni, faculty, students, and friends. It is wonderful to see you here. This has been a fantastic alumni weekend, and I can't think of a better way to cap off the weekend than with this evening's event, the inaugural Global Conservation Lecture. And I want to acknowledge our Campfire professor, Dr. Jerry Ballant, and thank you for helping put this event together for all of us to enjoy this evening. I want to acknowledge where we stand, that we have the privilege of meeting today in the ancestral lands of the Onondaga Nation, the center of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Confederacy, who we honor for the many contributions, including the original philosophy and practice of environmental stewardship. Before I introduce our wonderful speaker, I first want to acknowledge the individuals and organizations who made this possible. Sponsorship of this event and lecture series was made possible through the generosity of the ESF Alumni Association, the Department of Environmental Biology, and I did see our chair, Dr. Melissa Fierke, come in, welcome, ESF alumnus, Dale Travis, and the Campfire Conservation Fund. The fund has a deep history in wildlife conservation throughout North America and beyond, and has also provided ESF an endowment which allowed us to establish our first endowed professorship in wildlife conservation. I would like to thank all of our sponsors for their generous and continued support. Sorry, there's 2 mics, and I didn't realize I was hitting one of them. I was watching the other one. Sorry about that. It is now my privilege to introduce our speaker this evening, Dr. Healy Hamilton, a biodiversity scientist whose passion for life's diversity is reflected in a career that has been equally diverse. Through her work, both in the field and in the laboratory, she has studied cloud forest birds, the ecology of tropical trees, the evolution of the world's river dolphins, the origin of species richness in rainforests, and the taxonomy and evolution of seahorses, sea dragons, and their relatives. After obtaining her master's degree from Yale and her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, Dr. Hamilton spent 10 years at the California Academy of Sciences, one of the world's preeminent natural history museums and the oldest scientific institution west of the Mississippi River. By integrating spatial data extracted from the museum's vast specimen collections with digital data about climate and the environment, her lab began mapping and modeling patterns of biodiversity that addressed practical questions about how to conserve life on Earth. Dr. Hamilton's career continued in that same practical applied science vein when she moved to the DC area 7 years ago to become chief scientist at NatureServe, a biodiversity information network focused on management and conservation of at-risk species and ecosystems. At NatureServe, Dr. Hamilton leads a staff with expertise in ecology, zoology, botany, conservation, data science, and information management. Together, they deliver foundational information on the distribution, conservation status, and trends of species and their habitats. Among her many accomplishments, Dr. Hamilton is an honorary fellow of the World Conservation Monitoring Center, a member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, Species Survival Commission, an elected executive committee member of the IUCN U.S. National Committee, and a member of the Key Biodiversity Areas Committee. Dr. Hamilton is the past president of the Society for Conservation GIS, a Switzer Foundation Environmental Leadership Fellow, and a former U.S. Fulbright Scholar. She has mentored dozens of students and interns and co-authored over 50 scientific papers, the most recent of which is a major new publication bringing biodiversity data and cutting-edge modeling to create an unprecedented new guide to preventing extinctions in our country. This model and guide is the focus of her talk this evening. And now it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker and our inaugural Global Conservation Lecturer, Dr. Healy Hamilton. Welcome.
That was the longest introduction anyone has ever given me, and and now I'm feeling really old because it took a long time to achieve all of those experiences. So thank you so much to all of you for coming out tonight, for being part of the community that we kick off here with this inaugural lecture series. I started, hold on, give me just 1 second here. So I started off a couple weeks ago thinking about what did I want to talk about tonight. And I came up with this incredibly lofty title, Biodiversity and Global Change, the Nature of Conservation. I thought, oh, that's a cool sort of double entendre, the nature of conservation. I like that. And then I realized I'd actually already given Jerry the title of my talk, which was Precision Conservation at the Scale of a Nation. And so what I'm going to do is actually span both of those topics in a pretty far-ranging presentation where I plan on covering a lot of material. So hold on to your seats here. There's a lot to cover, but I think that you're going to, even if you have a current appreciation for biodiversity, even if you understand or even work in its current management and conservation, my goal is for you to at least learn something tonight, be inspired by what is happening in the world of conservation, and maybe deepen your roots with the community of those of us who are trying to conserve biodiversity. So I would really like to start off just being so grateful to the Campfire Conservation Fund, to the Alumni Fund of ESF, to Jerry Ballant as the host. It's such an honor for me to be in this position as the inaugural speaker of this very important lecture series. So I'm going to ask you to just be really quiet for the next moment because I want to start off giving us an appreciation for biodiversity that we will both see and hear. That's an acoustic signal from the deepest, darkest rainforests in Borneo that was generated by my friend and colleague, Dr. David Monaki, as part of his Fragments of Extinction project. That's often what we think of when we think of biodiversity, is sort of the diversity of life in tropical rainforests or coral reefs. That's the first sort of reaction. I want to turn this completely around and start off with how biodiversity is part of your practical everyday life, starting with what we're going to be doing right after I finish talking. We're going to have a reception, right? So let's start with what we're doing right now. Let's realize that as we consume our beer or wine or champagne or spirits, the very ingredients that created those are part of biodiversity. The diversity of options that we have when we think of these different beverages exists because there's a rich diversity of plants upon which they're based that we rely on to produce them, right? So agave for tequila, grapes, grains, these species in turn need pollinators to be able to reproduce. They need healthy soil biodiversity in order for us to be able to harvest them. So that beverage that you'll be consuming later tonight is actually a gift from the complex web of life that needs all of its parts in order to give us the benefits that we derive from it. Even more basic is the simple fact that every calorie ever consumed by all mankind in all of history is actually biodiversity, right? So supplying safe and nutritious food for a growing population, that requires that we increase food production globally, but without undermining the ability for future generations or the planet's capacity to be able to meet its own sustenance needs. So a solution to the fact that our planet is changing and we need to increase food production is to be diverse in our food resources, which is something that we're not doing that well right now. There are hundreds of thousands of plant species here on Earth with us. We only cultivate a few thousand, and a very narrow proportion of those actually are responsible for most of the calories that people eat on the planet. So returning diversity to our food systems is one of the ways that we will fare better in a world that is beset by global change. So there's been sort of increased focus on how ecosystem services are part of biodiversity. So it's not just that we directly eat the food, but that food is pollinated for free by ants and bees and wasps and bats. And there's been a lot of focus in trying to quantify what the value of these free services that we get from nature are. And the numbers, I literally put the zeros up here so we could see how staggering the numbers are. The estimates range between $200 billion and $400 billion a year in services that are provided for free by our pollinators. We often don't think of medicine as biodiversity, but evolution has produced just an astonishingly creative array of diverse sort of chemicals, molecular entities, and those in turn provide for us infinite resources for new drug development. So sort of that millions of years of chemical evolution has produced this pharmacopoeia that is way more advanced and way more creative than what we're able to synthesize in the labs. And so natural products for many human cultures have been the backbone of traditional systems of healing, and they still are. About half of the drugs that are approved, that have been approved for use during the last 30 years are derived either directly or indirectly from natural products. And here's just one example, right? We can only generate that benefit of medicines from biodiversity if that diversity of life is sustained. And here's a sad example of one that wasn't. So this is the brooding gastric frog. This frog is only found, or was only found, in a small part of the northeastern Australian rainforest. The mother frog is able to convert her stomach into a womb. Her eggs actually develop in her stomach. Somehow, she's able to stop production of hydrochloric acid while her brood is developing. Around 20 to 25 tadpoles would hatch inside of her and actually grow over 6 weeks. And eventually, through a not very attractive naming process called propulsive vomiting, she would vomit them into the world as fully formed little froglets. So if this amphibian can actually stop making hydrochloric acid, that is an incredible breakthrough for all kinds of issues that people have with digestion, with ulcers. And, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to show you the video of the cool frog. So that is an incredible possible medical discovery. But the last frog was seen in the wild in this habitat in 1981, and the last captive individual died in 1983. And that habitat in the Queensland rainforest was threatened by feral pigs, by invasive weeds, by pollution, diverted waters. The chytrid fungus also played a role in its demise. So the loss of the diversity of life actually undermined our ability to improve human health. There has been no other animal that is known that had that reproductive method. It's not just biodiversity on land, it's also in the ocean, where we're extracting our medical discoveries. These are just, not your charismatic megafauna that inspire ocean conservation. Most people, when they see a sea cucumber, sort of go, ew. However, they can regenerate their central nervous cord. And no other animals are able to do that. And so Parkinson's disease and Huntington's disease and other central nervous system disorders that follow strokes, cures for afflictions that affect millions of people, they may be possible if we can learn how to regenerate the neurons and fibers in the mammalian spinal cord. And these echinoderms, along with some other cousins like starfish and sea urchins, have these regenerative capacities that could serve as a model. So just to sort of really solidify that point, that the diversity of life is directly connected not just to our well-being, but to opportunities for improving human health in the future. So the example of the sea cucumber is sort of where biomedicine meets biomimicry. Biomimicry is a relatively new science that uses inspiration from the diversity of form and function in life to solve engineering problems. Like, how do we reduce the resistance when water flows over a surface? Or how do we get very lightweight, strong, and yet flexible materials, which we understand from studying bones or from trees? And this is the latest example, sort of one of the latest and greatest. This is the diabolical armor-clad beetle. The diabolical ironclad beetle. And this creature, it has recently been discovered in the desert Southwest. It turns out that this beetle has microstructures in its carapace, like the covering of its body, that allow it to withstand crushing of 40,000 times its weight. And it's done this by this amazing sort of three-dimensional interdigitation, this like interlocking in its carapace, so that literally you can drive like a Toyota Land Cruiser over this thing and it is going to be just fine. And it's solved this engineering problem that's quite common, that at any point that two plates meet, that is their weakest point. And this interlocking three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle is what now might allow us to make stronger body armor, for example, and where those plates meet can be made much stronger. The thing is, beetles are also not flagships for conservation. They are the largest group of animals on Earth. There's at least 30,000 species of beetles just in North America. We don't know how many of those beetles are doing, but for those for which we have conducted a conservation status assessment to understand what its conservation status is, 60% of them are declining. And so what happens when we lose species, right? We lose so much more than just, oh, there goes another taxon that I didn't really know that much about and didn't have that much to do with my life. It is diversity of genes, diversity of compounds, diversity of function. It's an inspiration, in this case, for art out of beetles, right? It inspires so many aspects of our daily lives. So that's not the only latest. There's one more sort of biomimicry example that is brand new that I thought was just published last month. It's so cool, and it's inspired from the way that seeds disperse in wind. It's the smallest ever human-made structure, flying structure, and it's called a microflyer. Essentially, bioengineers at Northwestern University have found a way to put an electric circuit on top of a very, very small, small flyer that is mimicking how seeds are dispersed in wind, especially maple seeds. So this is a device that can sense the environment, can sense public health, that can sense environmental contamination, and it just can disperse with it needs no type of engine at all, no type of propulsion. You can just disperse it into the wind, and they've even made it so that after it rains, it will disintegrate. It will land on a blade of grass and just dissolve after it transmits the information that it has gathered about the environment. So astonishing bioengineering breakthroughs that are coming from just understanding what nature has for us to copy. So you get the idea, right? Biodiversity is, it's the clothes literally on our backs, it's the sheets in our beds, it's the rugs that we are walking on. It's those forests are providing the wood that we live in, the paper products that you're going to wrap your Christmas presents in and write your Christmas cards with. Biodiversity is absolutely fundamental to the well-being of all of us and all other human societies. We just don't think of it that way. We don't have that deep appreciation for it as much as we need to. So it's not just the individual species, but it's how they interact and how they interact with their environment, right? It's not just those direct benefits of food and medicine and materials. Species shape their environments. Directly or indirectly, they can affect the availability of resources for other species in the environment. So this is a landscape in which species actually dig holes that become wells where then willows and cottonwoods germinate, and then they serve as nurseries for other trees and habitat for other animals. And it's actually horses and their relatives that are doing this digging. They engineer desert water availability by digging wells. So there were some colleagues that set a bunch of camera traps at 4 sites in the Sonoran and Mojave deserts, and to observe equids bioengineering their habitats. And these equids, these horses and donkeys, they created an oasis, like boons to wildlife. Badgers showed up, black bears showed up, birds, including declining birds, such as the elf owl in the upper corner there. So they actually documented 57 other species that showed up in these wells that were dug by this, in this case, they were North American, mostly wild horses. And that is not just happening in the dry lands of North America. Those donkeys and those horses there's a whole bunch of different species that can exhibit this in dry lands that are all over the world. Both native and actually introduced feral animals are engineering their environments. We've really just begun to understand the extent to which species engineer the environment that affects other species in ways we still don't fully understand. And probably the ultimate example of a species engineering its environment are coral reefs, right? This is just one little segment of the Great Barrier Reef, right? Corals create these reef structures that are so huge, they are actually visible from space, right? 350,000 square kilometers of engineered habitat from these tiny individual little coral polyps over millennia. And in doing so, they're creating habitat for other organisms and sometimes sort of controlling the availability of resources for those organisms. So we don't fully appreciate often the way that our planet's been physically shaped by the diversity of life. And so something to think about a little bit more when you're on your next snorkel in a coral reef. In an era of rapid change, we find that a lot of the ecosystems that we are familiar with are actually far more valuable than we previously understood. So these are seagrass beds, for example. So we've known that they buffer coastlines by absorbing the impact of storm surge, but that's increasingly valuable in a time of global change. We also know they provide habitat for lots of commercially important marine species, especially when they're young. They're sort of like nurseries. They also, we've found, remove carbon far faster than tropical rainforests do. They cover 1/5 of 1% of the ocean's seafloor, but they're responsible for about 10% of the carbon that is being uptaken by the ocean. Another ecosystem that we're learning more and more about its many different values are mangroves. Right? Natural carbon scrubbers. They grow really fast. They suck carbon out of the atmosphere. They stash it away in soils that end up being quite rich. They grow very quickly, and their wood is used for construction and for fuel wood. They're also excellent above-ground systems for beekeeping. And then below ground, again, they're nurseries for commercially important fish, and they're stabilizing the coast. All of those different values we don't always put an economic value on, and increasingly we are trying to understand what is what are these values of these ecosystems, right? So we say biodiversity and ecosystems, but all of it truly is biodiversity. And so the closer that we look, the more we understand that the natural world, in all of its genetic and chemical and biological and ecological diversity, all of its interactions and all of its processes, all of its beauty and all of its fragility, that we are totally dependent on it, that it is the key to our own well-being as individuals, as families, and as communities. So how we manage the natural world is going to really to determine the future of the quality of life on this world. So that's the theme for the rest of my talk, is how we will manage and to conserve the natural world, to protect what's left and to restore what is degraded. And really, we are in charge of this task. We live in the era of the Anthropocene, where the fate of nature, which I really hope by now I've convinced you that it is inextricable from our own fate, the fate of nature will be decided by our actions. And I feel like this video is one that really brings that message home. But we're going to dive into the science of conservation and to some of the unprecedented data and tool sets that we have to inform those management and conservation actions, to determine which are the places that are most important to protect, which are the places that are most important to restore, how we're going to minimize the competition for resources and space between people and wildlife. And for the rest of this talk, we're going to bring it home to our own country, which is actually extraordinarily blessed with very rich biodiversity. So we're going to go back in time to 1968, to what is probably arguably still the single most important environmental photograph ever taken, the first photograph of Earth from space in 1968. So, right, it's more than 50 years ago, completely influential in mobilizing a movement that was already underway of people demanding clean air, pure water, for species like the bald eagle to not go extinct. This is a picture from the first Earth Day on April 22nd, 1970. It's estimated about 20 million people poured into the streets demanding legislation to take care of our species and their habitats. So over the next couple years, this is when we saw the passage of the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and the Endangered Species Act, signed by Richard Nixon in 1973, which then creates a mandate for the federal government to protect and recover species that are at risk of extinction. So how do you do that? You have to know which species are out there, where they're found, and how imperiled they are. So in 1974, the nascent Nature Conservancy begins to mobilize the world's first biodiversity information network so that we have a way to answer these questions, to actually fulfill the legislative mandate that the Endangered Species Act has now put before us. And so, in recognition that we have this need to discover and document and understand biological diversity, the Nature Conservancy conceives of this network of what they call natural heritage programs, and they're designed to answer just those exact fundamental questions about what species exist, where they are found, and how imperiled they are. So over the next couple decades, this actually works. The world's first biodiversity information network is founded and grows to include every state in the US, every province in Canada, and many countries in Latin America that were also affiliates of this biodiversity information network. So it quickly grows and spreads throughout the US, throughout North America and into South America. And they are sharing methods for how they are collecting this information, so that it is truly a network of shared methods so that that data can communicate across geographic borders. So that is the foundation of what is now the NatureServe network today, these fundamental questions that we ask. What is out there? Where is it found? How is it doing? What options do we have for conserving or restoring it? How do we manage it? And today, we increasingly face the question of, and how is it changing? So from the very beginning of the network, computers and sort of biodiversity information management using technology was in our DNA. It was part of what we did. So this is going all the way back to the 1970s and punch cards, and then in the 1980s, D-based systems. In 1988, sort of the first version of what was called the Biological and Conservation Data System. So all of these programs collected information in similar ways and then computerized it to the extent possible with the technology of the time. What that allowed over time, for example, here in 1993, the first time that all this data was analyzed in aggregate. So we could answer questions such as, what is the role of today's protected areas in conserving imperiled species? You can't actually ask that question unless you have consistent information across a large geography, collected and analyzed in the same way. So this type of perspective is only made possible because of this network operating with these shared standards and methods and a computerized information management system. So fast forward then to today. This is a busy and complicated slide, but it has a really important message for this audience and beyond. What you're looking at here is today's understanding of which species in the US are imperiled. And we're looking across many different taxonomic groups. So the width of the bar is a reflection of the number of species analyzed in that bar. These conservation status assessments that have been conducted over decades, they are broken into a 5-step ranking system. So globally critically imperiled, those are the red boxes in these, on these bars. Globally imperiled, that's orange. Globally vulnerable is yellow. The light blue and the dark blue are those that are apparently secure or secure. So this is the summary of the current conservation status of a large diversity of species in our country. And the message is about a third of our biodiversity is sliding towards extinction. And in some cases, if you look at cacti, so cacti, it's about half. If you look at freshwater invertebrates, it's even a little closer to half. If you look at out of all of these degrees of imperilment, same with cacti, almost half of those taxa are at risk of extinction, right? In different stages of sliding towards extinction, but this is just an unacceptable erosion of the species richness, like the richness of life that I've just argued for the last half hour, our well-being utterly depends on. And so with this type of knowledge, we are armed with the ability to go out and reverse these trends, prioritize where we need to protect, figure out where we can reduce conflicts, and that's what the rest of this talk will be about. At NatureServe, which is the umbrella organization spun off from the Nature Conservancy as an independent nonprofit in the year 2000. So we are the umbrella now of the natural heritage programs. And we are committed to sharing this information as broadly as possible. So NatureServe Explorer is our online encyclopedia of life with almost data on almost 100,000 species and ecosystems. And it tells you what are they, how imperiled are they, all kinds of interesting facts about their life history. So this is sort of a tool. It fields millions of inquiries a year. And we try to provide information to all kinds of, to students and teachers and conservationists and practitioners and managers so that they have access to the information they need to be able to manage and conserve the diversity of life. And it's not just about the US either, it's our Canadian partners and our Latin American partners as well. So here we are, it's 2021. For almost 50 years, this network has been collecting on-the-ground, high-quality information about, mostly focused on imperiled species, right, where they are found. So we have these observations of species occurring in nature. But they really reflect, where have we had the chance to get out into the field? They can't be everywhere all the time. There's many private lands that can't be sampled. There's other lands that are inaccessible. So these primary observations tell us a lot, but they can't fill in the gaps. They can't tell us the whole story. So as unique and valuable as these data are, they really only represent our collective opportunity for where we've been able to go into the field. And what we need is much more consistent and comprehensive coverage of our understanding of where species occur and to what degree they are imperiled. So I want to take us to this very practical example in Texas to show you how we're using data from the NatureServe network along with advanced ecological modeling and cloud computing to really bring conservation and technology together to answer practical questions. So this is a real-world example. These are road construction projects that are planned in Texas in the next 4 years. So Texas is going to be really busy widening its roads. Texas also has this absolutely beautiful golden-cheeked warbler. It breeds in Texas, and it's only in Texas. There's no other state in the country that it breeds in. It's a neotropical migratory bird, so it spends part of its life cycle down in the neotropics. And this bird is listed as endangered on the Federal Endangered Species Act. So that means that the Texas Department of Transportation really has to care whether or not its road widening projects are going to harm this endangered songbird. On the right is the map, this broad range map that actually is the county boundaries in the counties where this bird has been observed. That's the range map that they're using to try to understand, could there be conflict between road construction and where the golden-cheeked warbler lives? And so these are broad and imprecise. This is not the type of information that is going to allow us to understand, well, exactly where is the golden-cheeked warbler habitat, and exactly where are we going to have those road projects, and how do we minimize these conflicts? We need better information than this type of broad range map. But for many species, this, in fact, is the type of information we currently have. So we're setting out to change that. So these are sort of the two extremes. On the left, you have the Texas Natural Diversity Database, which is the NatureServe partner in Texas. And this is where the biologists there have gone out into the field and they've been able to document occurrences where they know the golden-cheeked warbler is actually breeding. These are high-value, high-quality, known occurrences of the golden-cheeked warbler. But 95% of Texas is on private lands. There's probably more golden-cheeked warblers out here that we haven't found. This just represents where we've been able to look. We know this underrepresents where they occur. On the right, this is that Fish and Wildlife Service range map, the counties where the golden-cheeked warblers are. So we can use advanced ecological modeling and cloud computing and to leverage the information that we have where these species occur to get a much better understanding and reduce those conflicts between people and nature. So we're going to take this high-quality information from the Natural Heritage Program in Texas, all the locations where we know the golden-cheeked warbler is. And then we're going to use digital information about the environment, information about soils, about topography, about climate, like a whole suite of digital environmental data layers, because those are available to us now. And then we're going to run a model that says, okay, here's the combination of conditions that occur where we know the warbler occurs, the combination of environmental conditions in these known locations. We can then create a model in space of where else the habitat for that species occurs. So the model is basically saying the combination of conditions that the warbler needs is distributed in space in this way, where the darker red is higher probability of suitable habitat for that warbler. We can threshold that to really bring it to just the highest probability of warbler habitat. These are 30-meter resolution models. We're getting pretty precise. We're doing it through an ecological modeling process that is repeatable and transparent, and we're producing a hypothesis that is based in science and based on the best available technology for understanding where the species is distributed. So now we can go back to our construction project and we can say, okay, if we were using the Fish and Wildlife Service map, here's where all kinds of conflict might exist between road construction and the warbler. But the fact is that isn't all the warbler habitat. We can define where the warblers are and where they aren't in relation to planned road construction. We can be precise in our efforts to mitigate the negative impacts that we are likely to have. We can identify the places where conflict simply doesn't exist. We can reduce that conflict. This type of precision conservation is the information that we need here in this century to be able to better balance where we're going to do which activities, where are we going to conserve, where are we going to restore, where are we going to have to develop. Those conflicts exist, and we can turn them into situations where we try for whichever outcome is best for nature with the information that we have. So NatureServe is taking this species habitat modeling to scale for the imperiled species of our nation. We have looked at 2,216 of our most critically imperiled and imperiled species, and we've done this not just for birds and mammals and amphibians, but for over 1,600 imperiled plants, for hundreds of freshwater invertebrates that are that most imperiled segment of biodiversity in our country. We've done it for pollinating insects. So we're able to provide maps of where these species are distributed, and then we can stack those up on one another and ask ourselves, where is suitable habitat for the most imperiled species in our country? That has been, we've generated that through a project called the Map of Biodiversity Importance, and that has been an effort with funding from Esri and the Nature Conservancy and the Microsoft AI for Earth program, and also with the collaboration of many natural heritage programs, including the New York Natural Heritage Program, who is here tonight. So the Map of Biodiversity Importance is a product that takes 2,216 imperiled species distribution maps and asks, what is our roadmap to preventing extinction? How do we balance better those demands of development and those demands for not eroding the diversity of life that is the necessary gift to our own well-being? So this map is not generated just for all species. There's actually 15 maps in all. Here we're zooming in just to freshwater aquatic and freshwater invertebrates in the southeastern US, and we can see individual reaches of individual streams that are filled with species that are on the brink of extinction. So this is where we need to make sure that our forests, our forest watersheds are protecting the water quality for these stream reaches if we want to maintain the diversity of life that we've been blessed with. And this is the kind of incredible crayfish. Like crayfish, you know, some of us had them in tanks when we were little kids and they didn't look anything like this. They are absolutely amazing, super important for the aquatic food chains. There's mussels also that have incredible life history, and these are truly threatened organisms, and we just haven't had a good understanding of where we need to focus our conservation efforts. So I want to emphasize that this Map of Biodiversity Importance idea is not, it is a series of map products, but equally it is a process. It's a process that is bringing technology, cloud computing, ecological modeling, and the experts of the Natural Heritage Network all together in a way that can be iterated, right? We don't need static one-off map products in a rapidly changing world. We need to be able to always use the best available data, starting with the input of those species occurrences, And then including those, what we call environmental predictors, those digital data layers describing the environment that get input into a modeling engine that is in the cloud, that basically produce a hypothesis of where, at fine spatial resolution, of where a given species is found, that then gets reviewed by species experts, where they can tell us if our model is any good, that can get then validated in the field. This becomes almost like a treasure hunt map for biologists to go out and test the models. Hey, it says that there's high probability of suitable habitat in this place I've never looked. We now have dozens of examples of being able to discover new populations of imperiled species guided by these models. And then that information goes back into the modeling process so that the information for management and decision of imperiled biodiversity is always getting better and better. That process requires information about the environment, and I just put these 4 maps up here just as an example. We actually have 270 data layers describing the environment in our environmental data library that is in this cloud modeling engine. So things like mean summer temperature, or the extent of coniferous forest, or the distance to wetland. These are all ways that we can parse the environment to describe exactly what kinds of conditions do imperiled species need in the modeling process. We've also taken steps to make sure that this is not an academic exercise, but that these models can be understood by managers. So again, co-authored with Dr. Tim Howard, the chief scientist of the New York Natural Heritage Program, who's here tonight. This is a publication that we produced a couple years ago that is about how do we get these models into the hands of decision makers in ways that they have confidence that they can be used for the day-to-day decisions that they are required to make. So what we did is we looked at all the decisions you make here on this axis. So you make decisions about the occurrence data, decisions about the environmental data, decisions about the modeling algorithm. And what we said is, if you do it this way, it may be problematic. If you try it this way, it's okay. And actually, here is the most robust way to try to make those decisions. So we've sort of created a matrix that allows you to be able to understand what is the quality of a model, what confidence do I have in it for the types of decisions that I need to make every day. And then finally, perhaps the most importantly, we created an online secure geospatial model review tool where an expert, and in this case we've been using the experts from the Nature Serves Natural Heritage Network, to be able to pull down the species that they have some understanding of, pop up what the model outcome is, and then they can give it a Yelp score like 1 to 5. They can drop their own data in there to test the model with their own observations. They can edit out. They can say, oh no, you over-predicted here or you under-predicted here. And all of that feedback is recorded, and then we can iterate the model again based on that feedback. So we're using data, ecological modeling, geospatial tools, and a network of species experts to try to create the highest precision information about where imperiled species occur, which is the most fundamental question we have to answer in order to conserve species. So I'm headed towards the end here, but I want to bring it home to here in New York State and just give you a little example. So we're in the southeastern part of New York State. This is your little locator map here. And we are in an area that has a lot of protection. So this dark green here is from the Protected Areas database, and it's showing us the Big Indian Wilderness, the Side Mountain Wilderness, the Balsam Lake Mountain Wild Forest. So this is an area that already has a lot of protection. How is it doing for imperiled species? Is this a place where there are species that are being protected? Because there's often a mismatch there. This is adding the conservation easements, right? The private efforts to be able to fill in those interstitial spots, right? Create a larger, more connected, protected area. So really important effort that's coming here from private conservation easements. Then we're going to add a data layer from the Nature Conservancy that is about climate change resilience. And it turns out this whole area, all that orangey red, this whole area, the Nature Conservancy has done a nationwide analysis and says this whole area is very important for climate resilience. And then we can add products from the map of biodiversity importance and say, well, is it also protecting imperiled species? And the heart of it absolutely is. We have bats. We have a couple species of imperiled bats. We have a beautiful plant. And so we are able to really specify, add to the biodiversity values in this area of New York that is already being protected. But we can also ask the flip side of the question. So we're going to go down to southwestern Virginia. So the locator map here shows you that we're in southwestern Virginia, which is the southern Appalachia. This is an area that is generally known to be filled with imperiled species, and we're trying to add some specificity to that. So here you're looking at the relatively sparse level of protection that currently exists in this southeastern Virginia area. You've got North Carolina, a bit of Tennessee. If we add the conservation easements, we can see, there's little pockets of conservation easements, but together it's not adding up to a huge amount of protection in this area. Then we ask, what has the Nature Conservancy said about the climate resilience in this area? And there's a lot of it. There's a lot of areas here that are important for connectivity, for ecological integrity, for the types of landscapes and features that are going to be important for maintaining species and ecosystems and their function in an era of climate change. And then we can say, well, what about imperiled species? They're everywhere in this area. There are dozens of imperiled species and very little protection. And we can ask, what are the characters? Well, it turns out there's bats, there's fish, there's plants, there's mussels. There are a whole lot of species that are either globally critically imperiled or globally imperiled that have habitat in this region. This type of information can also be inputs, right? So the map of biodiversity importance we call MOBI, and we've used it as an input here into creating a data layer about high ecological value forests to support sustainable forestry and private forest conservation efforts. So all the areas that you see here have the map of biodiversity importance and things like landscape condition, what are the blocks of forests. So we're able to bring precision to the act of conservation through this type of data, tools, cloud computing, ecological modeling, and leveraging the people and experts of our network. So wrapping it up and trying to weave it all together, there is really no magic wand that we can wave to wave away the effects of biodiversity decline and global change. Like, we are the ecosystem engineers. We've created a world in which the abundance and diversity of the life that we depend on is, in fact, eroding. But because we are ecosystem engineers, right, and this is the world we created, through a combination of our efforts and our interventions, we also have the opportunity to face these challenges. Protect what is left, restore what is degraded. And it can't just be those of us who are scientists. And so I have one last data graphic to show you that is a little challenging to understand, but it has a really important message. It shows us just how large the community we have to mobilize towards conservation really is. This is like a race car graph going back a century, and what you're looking at here is the observations of species that we have, mostly that have come from natural history, right? So you've got the National Museum of Natural History, you've got the California Consortia of Herbaria, you've got the Field Museum, the Cal Academy, and then citizen science comes along and utterly dwarfs 150 years of natural history observations, right? So eBird from Cornell University, the amount of information that we are obtaining by mobilizing citizen scientists is literally transforming our understanding of what species occur where on the planet. That is truly a transformational opportunity for us to be able to reach out to new communities, engage them in the effort of conservation, use tools and technology to be able to then leverage that data for the type of precision conservation that I've told you about. So being an ecosystem engineer does not have to be a lonely job, right? There's all kinds of ways to get involved in creating the future that we want, right? The challenges that we face in our lives, in our communities, in our societies, they can sometimes just seem like desperately overwhelming. But we also, as I've tried to show today, we have like the most diverse sets of data, the most powerful tools for turning it into information that is relevant to how we manage and conserve the diversity of life across space and across time. Technology can connect us into networks where we can work together to sort of solve our common problems in ways that are have never before been possible. Just by being here, you are part of an incredibly important community and network for facing the type of problems that we talked about today. And so that community exists right here, and you're already part of it. Thanks to the generosity of donors such as the Campfire Conservation Fund and the vision of scientists such as Jerry Ballant, we are deepening, this community is deepening its commitment to conservation. And all of you are invited to be part of that. Like, for example, with the establishment of the Global Wildlife Conservation Center as a program of here at ESF. And I'm honored to serve on the advisory committee of that. And I will also call out the New York Natural Heritage Program, which is a program of ESF and funded largely by Department of Environment Conservation, that is another way of having a guide to your community, to your network, to the biodiversity that surrounds you. So I strongly encourage you to find that community that shares your passion and deepen your commitment and engagement towards those shared values. I mean, if I've been at all successful in this talk, you now maybe have a deepening of your commitment to conserving that diversity of life that we all so obviously depend on. So everyone that's in this room and everyone who might be watching this presentation later, we are all part of that community that has a role in keeping our planetary web of life intact. So leverage that data, find your community, invest in building your network of collaborative solution finders, and I'm sure you will find that all along you were part of conserving biodiversity. Thank you so much.